On January 16, 2019, at approximately 2 in the morning, a small group of lawyers gathered in a conference room on the 39th floor of a Manhattan law firm. Outside, the city slept. Inside, they were dividing the corpse of the largest retailer in American history. The winning bid came to $5.2 billion. The bidder was Eddie Lampert, a hedge fund manager who had spent the previous 15 years as Sears' chairman and largest shareholder. He was, in effect, buying from himself what he had already spent a decade selling off piece by piece. Craftsman Tools gone, Kenmore Appliances gone, Land's End gone. The real estate parcelled and spun into separate entities he controlled. One creditor's lawyer would later put it plainly. Lampert had set the building on fire, then showed up at the auction to buy the ashes. There were no cameras in the room. No crowds gathered outside the Hoffman Estates headquarters in Illinois, where the company had been based since 1993. No former employees held vigils. The death of Sears, Roebuck and Company, a name that had once meant more to American households than any government agency, happened in the quiet of a law firm conference room, witnessed only by the people being paid to witness it. Judge Robert Drain, presiding over the Chapter 11 proceedings in the Southern District of New York, had accepted Lampert's credit bid 3 months earlier when the company formally collapsed. The October 2018 filing had surprised no one who had been paying attention, but attention itself had become the scarcest resource Sears possessed. The company that once employed more Americans than the federal government. The company whose catalogue had taught 3 generations of rural families what a washing machine looked like, what a bicycle cost, what prosperity was supposed to feel like in your hands, ended not with a bang or even a whimper, but with the shuffling of papers in a room full of lawyers whose names no one would remember. The final liquidation preserved approximately 425 stores and 45,000 jobs, at least on paper. But everyone in that room understood what they were really doing. They were dividing up the last negotiable pieces of a fortune that had once touched every county in America, and they were doing it for a man who had already extracted most of the value years earlier. This was not a rescue. This was paperwork. And somewhere in that paperwork, buried under the liability schedules and the asset inventories and the creditor claims, was a name that would not appear in any of the filings: Julius Rosenwald, the man who built Sears, the man who gave away more than $2 billion in today's money, nearly all of it to build schools for black children across the Jim Crow South. The man whose heirs had quietly divested, married out of the name, drifted away from the company and the mission, until there was no one left to object when the hedge fund manager arrived. Rosenwald had been dead for 87 years by the time his company went bankrupt. But the pattern of what happened, the long arc from fortune to philanthropy to generational drift to liquidation, that pattern didn't start in 2018. It didn't start when Lampert took control in 2005. It didn't start when the Rosenwald grandchildren began selling their shares in the 1970s. The seed of it was planted in the very mechanism that made Rosenwald rich in the first place, in the specific kind of genius he possessed and the specific kind of blindness that came with it. To understand how the largest retailer in human history ended in a conference room nobody bothered to attend, you have to go back to a different room entirely. A cramped office in Minneapolis in 1887, where a 23-year-old railroad station agent named Richard Sears was staring at a crate of watches nobody wanted. The watches were a consignment error. A jewelry company had shipped them to a retailer who refused delivery, and now they sat in the Minneapolis station, waiting for someone to claim them or pay to ship them back. Sears, who made $25 a month checking freight, saw something nobody else saw. He bought the watches himself, then wrote to other station agents along the rail line, offering them at a discount if they would sell to farmers and railroad workers in their towns. He sold every watch in 6 months. Then he ordered more. By 1888, Sears had moved to Chicago and founded the R.W. Sears Watch Company. By 1893, he had expanded into a general mail order catalogue, selling everything from jewelry to sewing machines to clothing. The catalogue was crude, the copy was breathless, and the operation was chaos. Sears understood how to write an advertisement that made a farmer in Nebraska feel like he was missing something essential. What Sears did not understand was how to ship that farmer the thing he had just been convinced to buy. This is where Julius Rosenwald enters the story. Rosenwald was 33 years old in 1895, a second-generation German-Jewish immigrant running a moderately successful clothing manufacturing business in Chicago. His suits were not remarkable. His sales methods were not innovative. But Rosenwald possessed a quality that would prove far more valuable than creativity. He could look at a system and see not what it was, but what it could become at scale. His brother-in-law, Aaron Nussbaum, brought him the opportunity. Nussbaum had heard that Richard Sears needed capital and partners. The mail order business was growing faster than Sears could manage. Orders were being lost, merchandise was being shipped to the wrong addresses, and the whole operation risked collapsing under the weight of its own success. Nussbaum saw a chance to buy in. He asked Rosenwald to split the investment. Rosenwald was skeptical. He knew nothing about mail-order retail, but he agreed to visit the Sears operation, and what he saw changed his life. The warehouse was bedlam. Orders piled up faster than workers could process them. Sears himself was brilliant at generating demand, but utterly indifferent to fulfillment. Rosenwald looked at this chaos and saw something extraordinary. A distribution nervous system waiting for someone to organize it. The American railroad network had just completed its continental reach. Rural free delivery, the Postal Service's new policy of delivering mail directly to farm addresses rather than requiring farmers to travel to town post offices, was about to transform how rural Americans received goods. And here was Richard Sears, generating more orders than any retailer in the country, with no idea how to fulfill them. Rosenwald invested $3,700 for a 25% stake. Within 3 years, he had bought out Nussbaum and begun the methodical transformation of Sears, Roebuck and Company into something unprecedented. He did not change the catalogue. Sears's hard sell copy, his breathless descriptions of merchandise, his genius for making a cream separator sound like a life-changing acquisition, all of that stayed. Rosenwald understood that demand generation was Sears's gift, and he had no intention of interfering with it. What Rosenwald changed was everything that happened after a customer placed an order. He studied the warehouse like an engineer studying a factory floor. He timed how long it took to retrieve a pair of boots from storage. He mapped the path a order slip travelled from the mailroom to the shipping dock. He counted the number of hands that touched each package, the number of steps workers walked, the number of minutes lost to searching for items that had been shelved in the wrong place. Then he redesigned everything. He installed conveyor belts that moved merchandise in a single direction through the building. He implemented pneumatic tubes that shot order slips from department to department faster than any messenger could walk. He color-coded product tags so workers could identify categories at a glance. He built chutes that fed packages directly to loading docks organized by railroad destination. By 1906, Rosenwald had constructed a new facility in Chicago's Homan Square that covered 40 acres and processed 20,000 orders per day during normal operations. During the Christmas season, that number surged to 100,000. The plant featured a sophisticated system of escalators, conveyor belts, and automated sorting machinery that ensured merchandise flowed in an uninterrupted stream from storage to shipping. Workers no longer searched for items. The items came to them. No one had ever built anything like it. The Homan Square plant was not merely a warehouse. It was the most advanced logistics system on Earth, a prototype for every distribution center that would follow for the next century. But Rosenwald, when asked about his success, attributed it to luck rather than vision. He told interviewers that he had no idea Sears would grow to even 5% of its eventual size. He described his early ambitions as modest. He had hoped to earn $15,000 a year, allocating 1/3 for living expenses, 1/3 for savings, and 1/3 for charity. The company had exceeded those hopes by a factor he could not have imagined. This modesty was not false. Rosenwald genuinely believed he had stumbled into fortune rather than built it. But the belief itself was significant. A man who thought his wealth was luck rather than destiny would think very differently about what that wealth was for. By 1906, the Sears catalogue had become something no one had intended it to be. In the cities, it was a convenience. In the rural Midwest and South, it was a lifeline. For farmers who lived miles from the nearest town, the catalogue was their window to the national economy, a document that told them what prosperity looked like and offered them a way to purchase it. The catalogue was thick, sometimes exceeding 500 pages. It contained everything from plows to pianos, work boots to wedding dresses. Its pages were printed on heavy paper that rural families found useful long after the merchandise had been ordered, as kindling, as insulation, as toilet tissue in outhouses. Children learned to read from catalogue descriptions. Farm wives studied the fashion plates to understand how women dressed in Chicago. The catalogue was not merely a sales document, it was an education in American material life. But for one group of customers, the catalogue meant something more. Black families in the rural South faced a particular set of obstacles when purchasing goods. Local merchants in Jim Crow towns routinely subjected black customers to humiliation. They were forced to wait until all white customers had been served. They were denied access to certain merchandise. They were charged higher prices for inferior goods. Some stores refused to serve them at all. The Sears catalogue offered an alternative. A black sharecropper in Alabama could order the same goods as a white farmer in Iowa, at the same price, delivered to the same kind of mailbox. The transaction was anonymous. The merchant could not see the customer's skin. For families who could not safely enter most American stores, this anonymity was a form of freedom. The catalogue's reach into black communities did not go unnoticed. In some southern towns, white supremacists organized bonfires to burn Sears catalogues, viewing them as a threat to the economic and social order that kept black families dependent on local white merchants. The act of ordering from Sears became, in certain places, a quiet act of resistance. Rosenwald, back in Chicago, was largely invisible to these customers. His name did not appear in the catalogue. From 1909 to 1924, the introductory letters that opened each edition went unsigned, with no executive claiming authorship or credit. Rosenwald's grandson, Peter Askerly, would later suggest that this anonymity was calculated. Anti-Semitism in early 20th century America was virulent and widespread. A Jewish name on the catalogue might have cost sales in certain regions. Rosenwald, whatever his private feelings, understood the business logic of staying hidden. But the anonymity cut both ways. Rosenwald could not see who was buying his merchandise any more than they could see who was selling it. The black families ordering from his catalogue were entries in a ledger, addresses in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, revenue that arrived without a face attached. Rosenwald was by this time one of the wealthiest men in America. His stake in Sears had grown to control of the company. He had assumed the presidency in 1908, overseeing an empire that was transforming the American consumer economy. And he was beginning to think about what to do with the money. His formula from those modest early years, 1/3 for expenses, 1/3 for savings, 1/3 for charity, had scaled beyond anything he could have anticipated. 1/3 of his annual income now represented a sum larger than the operating budgets of most American cities. The question of where to direct it was no longer a personal accounting exercise. It was a strategic decision with national implications. Rosenwald had already begun his philanthropy in the Jewish community, funding immigrant aid societies and contributing to the construction of synagogues. But he was restless with the scale. The wealth was arriving faster than he could deploy it, and the usual channels of charity felt insufficient to the magnitude of what he possessed. The turning point came not from a charitable appeal, but from a book. In 1910, Rosenwald read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. Washington's story of rising from enslavement to found Tuskegee Institute, of building an educational institution for black students in the hostile soil of Alabama, struck Rosenwald with a force he had not anticipated. Here was a man who had built something from nothing, who had scaled an operation through sheer organizational will, who had navigated hostile territory through a combination of diplomacy and determination. Rosenwald recognized something of himself in Washington's methods. He also recognized something in Washington's mission that connected to those anonymous orders arriving from the South. The black families buying Sears merchandise were not merely customers. They were a population systematically excluded from the educational and economic infrastructure that white America took for granted. They were buying goods from Rosenwald's catalogue because they could not safely buy goods in their own towns. And they were raising children who could not safely attend public schools that were funded for white students only. Rosenwald wrote to Washington, requesting a meeting. What began as a conversation about a modest donation to Tuskegee would evolve into the largest private educational initiative in American history, but that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, in 1910, Rosenwald was still the invisible architect of American aspiration, building a distribution system that reached every county in the nation, selling goods to customers he could not see, accumulating a fortune whose purpose he had not yet discovered. The machinery was in place. The capital was accumulating. The question of what it was all for remained unanswered, and back in that law firm conference room in 2019, as the lawyers finalised the paperwork that would close the last chapter of Sears, Roebuck and Company, not one of them mentioned the schools. Not one of them noted that the fortune being liquidated had once built 5,000 schoolhouses across the South, had educated 700,000 black children, had represented the largest partnership between a private philanthropist and a marginalised community in the nation's history. That story had been erased so completely that even the people dividing the estate did not know it had ever existed. The schools were still standing, many of them, converted to other uses or abandoned along rural roads in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. Some had been preserved as historic sites. Others had collapsed into the red clay that surrounded them. But the connection between those buildings and the catalogue that funded them, between Julius Rosenwald's fortune and the children who learned to read in classrooms he paid to construct, that connection had been severed by decades of quiet forgetting. How does generational amnesia erase a legacy that large? How does a family drift so far from a mission that once defined them that they no longer remember it existed? And how does the company built by that mission end up in the hands of a man whose only interest in it was extractable value? The answers lie not in the bankruptcy court, but in the decades that preceded it. They lie in the choices Rosenwald's children made, and the choices his grandchildren made, and the slow unwinding of commitment that happens when wealth becomes inheritance rather than creation. They lie in the specific mechanisms by which families lose not only their money but their purpose. But before we can understand how the Rosenwalds lost their company and forgot their mission, we have to understand what that mission was. We have to see what Julius Rosenwald built when he finally looked up from the ledger books and saw the faces of the customers who had made him rich. That story begins with a train ride south, a meeting with Booker T. Washington, and a handshake that would result in 5,000 schools appearing across a landscape where black children had been denied education by law. It is the story of how one man's fortune became another community's infrastructure, and how that infrastructure was built to last even after the fortune and the family and the company had all disappeared. The Home and Square plant continued processing orders. The catalogues continued arriving at rural mailboxes. The black families of the South continued buying merchandise from a company whose owner they could not name. And Julius Rosenwald, newly aware of who was making him rich, began to consider what he owed them in return. He arrived at Tuskegee in the spring of 1912, and what he found there was not what he expected. Rosenwald had visited institutions before. He'd toured factories across Europe, inspected warehouses from New York to San Francisco, evaluated operations the way he evaluated everything, by watching how materials move through systems. Tuskegee was different. The campus that Booker T. Washington had built from nothing in rural Alabama was a working model of self-sufficiency, a place where students constructed their own buildings, grew their own food, manufactured their own bricks. Washington had built a school that functioned like a small economy. Rosenwald recognized the logic immediately. It was his own logic, applied to education instead of commerce. The two men walked the grounds together. Washington was 56, exhausted by decades of negotiating between white benefactors who wanted gratitude and black communities who needed results. Rosenwald was 50, at the peak of his commercial powers, running the largest retail operation in America. They were an unlikely pair. But Washington understood something about Rosenwald that most white philanthropists of that era would never have grasped. Rosenwald was not interested in monuments. He was interested in systems. Washington's proposal was modest. Rural black children across the South had almost no access to education. County governments collected taxes from black families, but spent nearly all school funding on white students. In some counties, the per-pupil expenditure for white children was 10 times what was allocated for black children. The result was entirely predictable. Black children in rural Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Carolinas either received no schooling at all or attended class in churches, sheds, and private homes with no materials, no trained teachers, and no consistent schedule. Washington proposed that Rosenwald fund the construction of proper schoolhouses, small buildings with real classrooms designed for learning. Rosenwald agreed to fund 6 pilot schools in rural Alabama. The cost was minimal by his standards, but the conditions he attached to the money were not minimal at all. They were, in fact, the entire point. He refused to simply write checks. He required that black communities contribute their own funds, their own labour, and in many cases their own land to the construction of each school. He required that local white citizens contribute as well, and he required that county governments formally accept responsibility for maintaining the buildings once they were complete. The money Rosenwald provided was a seed grant, not a gift. It was a lever designed to pry open systems that had been locked shut. This was not generosity in the way that Andrew Carnegie's libraries were generosity, or in the way that John D. Rockefeller's university endowments were generosity. Carnegie and Rockefeller built things and put their names on them. The buildings existed because the money existed. Remove the money, and the buildings would eventually decay, because no local system had any stake in their survival. Rosenwald understood this. He'd spent 20 years building a company whose entire model depended on local participation. The catalogue didn't work if customers didn't trust it. The logistics didn't work if suppliers didn't deliver. And the schools wouldn't work if the communities that used them didn't own them. The mechanism he designed was, in its way, an act of coercion dressed as charity. When a black community in rural Mississippi raised $300 through bake sales, church collections, and the harvest from designated Rosenwald patches of cotton, and when that money was presented to a county school board alongside Rosenwald's matching grant, the board faced a choice: accept the money and take responsibility for a black school, or refuse the money and explain to white taxpayers why free infrastructure was being turned away. Most boards accepted, not because they believed in educating black children, but because the money was already on the table and refusing it made them look wasteful. Rosenwald had turned white civic shame into a construction budget. The architectural plans were standardized and deliberate. Each school featured large windows positioned so that natural light fell over students' left shoulders, reducing shadows on their writing surfaces. The buildings were modest, functional, and carefully designed to avoid provoking the attention of racist arsonists who had burned black churches and meeting halls across the region for decades. A Rosenwald school looked like what it was: a small public building, unremarkable from the road, built to last without announcing itself. This was architecture as survival strategy. Between 1912 and 1932, the program produced 4,977 schools, 217 teachers' homes, and 163 shop buildings across 15 southern states. The total construction cost reached $28.4 million. Of that sum, public tax funds provided roughly 64%. Black communities contributed approximately 17%, often through physical labour, donated land, and years of grassroots fundraising. Rosenwald's own contribution was roughly 15% of the total. Consider those numbers carefully. The man credited with building 5,000 schools actually paid for less than a sixth of their construction. That's not a criticism, it's the entire point. He designed a system where his money multiplied because it forced other money into existence. He spent $4.4 million of his own fortune. Black communities, many of them desperately poor, collectively raised $4.7 million. And public governments, shamed or leveraged into participation, provided the rest. By the time the program concluded, over 660,000 black children were attending Rosenwald schools, a number that would grow to over 700,000 in the years that followed. In today's dollars, Rosenwald gave away approximately $2 billion over his lifetime, not only to schools but to museums, Jewish charities, universities, and community organizations. But the schools were the centerpiece. They were also the proof of his theory. If you build a system that requires participation, the system survives its founder. If you simply hand people a building, the building dies when the money stops. Which raises the question that defines the rest of this story. If Rosenwald understood leverage, understood systems, understood that sustainability required local ownership, then why did he write into the charter of his own foundation that it must spend down its entire principal and dissolve within 25 years of his death? Why did the man who built the most successful philanthropic partnership of the 20th century deliberately ensure that the institution carrying his name would cease to exist? He answered this question directly, in writing, in 1919. Coming generations can be relied upon to provide for their own needs as they arise. He believed that perpetual endowments calcified, that foundations outliving their founders became self-serving bureaucracies more interested in their own survival than in the problems they were created to solve. He looked at the great fortunes of his era and saw men building monuments to themselves disguised as charity. He refused to become one of them. There is something admirable in that refusal, and something chilling. Because Rosenwald was betting that the systems he'd built, the schools, the community networks, the county board commitments, would survive without the institutional framework that had created them. He was betting that once black communities had their schools, they would keep them. He was betting that county governments, having accepted responsibility, would continue to meet it. He was betting on the goodness of systems he had personally forced into cooperation. He died on January 6, 1932, at the age of 69. The Great Depression had already cut his personal fortune by more than 2/3. Sears stock, which had traded as high as $180 a share in 1928, had fallen below $10. But the schools were standing, nearly 5,000 of them, spread across the South like a quiet grid of possibility, each one a small brick building with large windows and a community that had paid for its own stake in it. The Julius Rosenwald Fund continued operating after his death, as instructed. It distributed its remaining assets, funded fellowships for black artists and intellectuals including Marian Anderson, Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison, supported medical research, and methodically spent itself towards zero. In 1948, 16 years after Rosenwald's death, the fund officially closed its doors, its records were archived, its staff dispersed, and the institutional memory of what Rosenwald had built began its long, quiet fade from public consciousness. The schools themselves faced a different kind of erasure. Through the 1940s and early 1950s, they continued serving black communities across the South, often as the only adequate educational facilities available. But when the Supreme Court decided Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, ordering the desegregation of public schools, the policy response in many southern counties was consolidation. Black students were moved into formerly white schools. The Rosenwald buildings, small and rural and built for a specific community, were declared surplus. Some became community centres, some became storage facilities. Many were simply abandoned, left to settle into the red clay soil of Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina. The desegregation that was supposed to represent progress for black communities often meant the destruction of institutions those communities had built with their own hands and their own money. The Rosenwald schools were casualties of a policy that treated integration as a numbers problem rather than a cultural one. The buildings disappeared, and with them disappeared the physical evidence of what black families had accomplished through collective sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Rosenwald family itself was undergoing its own quiet transformation. Julius had 5 children. His son Lessing Rosenwald succeeded him briefly in Sears' leadership, but stepped away from active management in the late 1930s, preferring to focus on art collection and civic life. His daughter Edith married Edgar Stern, a New Orleans cotton broker, and became a significant philanthropist in her own right, funding civil rights work and cultural institutions in Louisiana. Another branch married into the Sulzberger family, publishers of the New York Times. None of this represented a dramatic break. No heir squandered the fortune on racehorses or gambling debts, and no family feud split the estate into warring factions. What happened was subtler and, in its way, more complete. The fortune migrated. It moved from a single concentrated purpose, from the specific identity of a man who built a company and then built schools with the proceeds, into the diffuse respectability of established wealth. The Sterns were philanthropists, the Sulzbergers were publishers, the Rosenwald name appeared on museum wings and hospital wards. But the connection to Sears, to the catalogue, to the schools, that connection thinned with each generation until it became purely genealogical, a fact of ancestry rather than a living commitment. Walter White, then Executive Secretary of the NACP, wrote upon Rosenwald's death that no name was more revered in black communities across the South. Within 2 generations, that reverence existed only in the memories of the oldest residents of those communities, people who had attended the schools as children and remembered what it meant to walk into a real classroom for the first time. Their children knew the name vaguely. Their grandchildren did not know it at all. This is what happens when a legacy is designed to dissolve. Rosenwald had insisted on impermanence because he believed future generations would build their own solutions. He was right about the building. He did not anticipate the forgetting. By the mid-1950s, the Rosenwald family's direct involvement in Sears governance had effectively ended. The company was now run by professional managers, men who had risen through the corporate hierarchy and who understood the business as a retail operation, not as the expression of a particular man's vision. This transition was neither sudden nor hostile. It was the natural result of a family choosing wealth management over corporate stewardship, choosing diversification over concentration, choosing comfort over the grinding daily work of running the largest retailer in America. The company they left behind was still enormous. In 1954, Sears operated over 700 stores across the United States. Its revenue exceeded $3 billion annually. It employed over 300,000 people. The catalog division alone processed millions of orders per year, but the logic that had built the company, the understanding that retail was a relationship between the seller and the most remote customer, the obsessive focus on logistics and trust and accessibility, that logic had become institutional habit rather than lived conviction. The people running Sears knew how to run Sears. They did not necessarily understand why Sears existed. Under Edward Brennan, who became CEO in 1984, the company pursued a strategy that made perfect sense if you read only the quarterly reports and no history at all. Sears had enormous consumer trust. It had millions of customer relationships. Why not sell those customers financial services alongside kitchen appliances? In 1981, Sears acquired Dean Witter Reynolds, the brokerage firm, and Coldwell Banker, the real estate company. In 1985, it launched the Discover credit card. The idea was to create a one-stop financial empire, a place where a family could buy a refrigerator, open a brokerage account, and close on a house all under the same corporate umbrella. The strategy was coherent on paper. It was also the exact opposite of what had made Sears successful. Rosenwald had built a company that delivered physical goods to remote customers with extraordinary efficiency. He'd built trust by fulfilling promises, by shipping the right product at the right time to the right address. Financial services required a different kind of trust entirely, one built on expertise and personal relationships rather than logistical reliability. The two businesses shared a customer base, but nothing else. Putting them together did not create synergy. It created confusion. By 1992, the contradictions had become untenable. Sears announced it would discontinue its general merchandise catalogue, the Big Book, the publication that had reached rural mailboxes since the 1890s, the mechanism that had introduced millions of Americans to consumer choice, the vehicle through which black families in the Jim Crow South had purchased goods they couldn't buy locally. The catalogue was losing money. Mail-order retail had been overtaken by physical stores and increasingly by early electronic commerce. The decision was rational. It was also the severing of the company's original purpose from its ongoing operations. Whatever Sears was after 1993, it was no longer the thing Julius Rosenwald had built. Between 1993 and 1995, the company reversed its diversification strategy, spinning off Dean Witter, Allstate, and Coldwell Banker to refocus on retail. But the retail operation they returned to was no longer dominant. Walmart had surpassed Sears as the nation's largest retailer in 1989. The market had shifted toward everyday low pricing, vast suburban stores, and supply chain optimization that made Sears's aging infrastructure look antique. The company was too big to be nimble and too slow to be competitive. Its stores were aging, its brand was fading, and its customers were growing older without being replaced by younger ones. Into this decline walked Eddie Lampert. In 2003, his hedge fund, ESL Investments, took a controlling stake in Kmart, which had itself emerged from bankruptcy. In 2005, he orchestrated the merger of Kmart and Sears, creating Sears Holdings Corporation. The merger was announced as a strategic combination that would allow both brands to compete with Walmart and Target. Analysts were skeptical from the start. Lampert was not a retail operator. He was a financial engineer trained under Robert Rubin at Goldman Sachs, a man who thought in terms of capital allocation and asset values rather than store layouts and customer experience. The question that would define the next 13 years was simple. Did Lampert believe he could restore a retail operation that had been declining for 2 decades? Or had he already calculated that the real estate portfolio beneath those 700 stores was worth more than the stores themselves? The answer would not become fully visible for years, but the trajectory was set. The trajectory was set, and Eddie Lampert moved along it with a patience that confused people who expected dramatic gestures. He did not gut the company overnight. He did not announce mass closures in a single press conference. What he did was quieter, more structural, and far more effective. He built a mechanism. Between 2005 and 2015, Sears Holdings closed stores steadily, roughly 50 to 100 per year, each closure reported individually, each one a local story rather than a national one. A Sears anchor store closing in a mid-size American city barely made the business section by 2012. It had become background noise. Meanwhile, capital expenditure on the remaining stores dropped to levels that made maintenance nearly impossible. Roofing went unrepaired, escalators broke and stayed broken, and fixtures aged into a kind of retail archaeology. Customers who walked into a Sears store in 2013 or 2014 often described the feeling of entering a place that had already closed but hadn't yet been told. The lights were on and the shelves were partially stocked, but nothing about the environment suggested anyone expected you to buy something. This was not neglect born of incompetence. It was, by the logic of Lampert's financial models, rational. You do not pour capital into an asset you intend to liquidate. You maintain it just enough to keep it generating revenue while you extract the underlying value through other channels. The channel Lampert built was called Seritage Growth Properties. In 2015, Sears spun off 235 of its best-located retail properties into this newly created real estate investment trust. The properties included Sears and Kmart stores positioned in high-value suburban corridors, the kind of real estate that anchor tenants had occupied since the shopping mall boom of the 1960s and 1970s. Under the Seritage structure, the retail operation that had previously owned these buildings outright now paid rent to occupy them. The stores became tenants in buildings that had once belonged to them. And when a store closed because it was losing money, because its roof was leaking, because its customers had stopped coming, the property reverted to Seritage, which could then lease the space to a higher-paying tenant. A Nordstrom Rack, a Whole Foods, a fitness chain, something that served a wealthier, younger customer in a way that the aging Sears store never could. The financial logic was elegant. The operating company absorbed the losses from declining retail. The REIT captured the real estate appreciation. Two entities, technically separate, technically governed by independent boards, but both ultimately controlled by the same man and funded by the same hedge fund. When Sears lost money on operations, its stock fell, and Lampert could acquire more of it cheaply. When Seritage leased vacated properties to premium tenants, its value rose. Value moved in one direction, liability moved in the other, and Lampert sat at the junction point holding positions in both. Warren Buffett noticed. In 2015, Berkshire Hathaway purchased 2 million shares of Seritage Growth Properties. Later, Berkshire provided the REIT with a $2 billion loan. Buffett, the most famous value investor alive, was not betting on the future of Sears retail. He was betting on the real estate underneath it, real estate that would become more valuable precisely as the stores above it disappeared. The Oracle of Omaha and the hedge fund manager from Greenwich were reading the same spreadsheet. They simply drew different public conclusions about what it meant. For the 45,000 workers who remained in Sears stores by 2017, the spreadsheet was not an abstraction. These were people who had built careers around a company that once offered middle-class employment with benefits, pensions, and a sense of institutional permanence. The pension plans they'd paid into for decades were, by the time of the bankruptcy filing, underfunded by approximately $1.5 billion. That gap did not materialize overnight. It grew year by year as the company directed its dwindling cash toward debt service, share buybacks, and real estate transactions rather than pension obligations. When Sears finally filed Chapter 11 on October 15, 2018, those pensions were among the unsecured claims at the bottom of the creditor hierarchy. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that insures private pensions, ultimately assumed responsibility for the plans. Workers received benefits, but often at reduced levels. The promises made to them in the 1980s and 1990s, when Sears was still a place you expected to spend a career, were not fully honoured. During the bankruptcy proceedings, creditors argued explicitly that Lampert's transactions had stripped the company of assets that should have been available to satisfy its obligations. The term used in legal filings was asset stripping. Lampert denied it. His attorneys argued that each transaction had been conducted at fair market value, approved by independent committees, and structured in compliance with corporate law. In 2022, the litigation was settled for $175 million, with no admission of liability. The legal question was closed. The financial question, whether a controlling shareholder can engineer a company's decline while profiting from the pieces, was answered not by the courts, but by the outcome itself. In January 2019, Lampert purchased the remaining Sears assets out of bankruptcy through a new entity called Transformco. The price was $5.2 billion, which sounds enormous until you measure it against the real estate portfolio's estimated value in 2005, when the Kmart merger was first completed. At that time, analysts valued the combined company's real estate holdings alone at more than what Lampert ultimately paid for the entire business, its brands, its remaining stores, its inventory, its customer relationships, and its intellectual property included. He paid less for the whole organism in 2019 than the skeleton had been worth 14 years earlier. The spread between those two numbers is the measure of what the operating business lost during the years of managed decline. One creditor's statement from the proceedings captured the assessment shared by many who had watched the process unfold. The strategy, the creditor said, had prioritized enriching the management, buyout partners, and their institutional backers over the survival of the retail icon. Lampert continued to deny this characterization. He maintained that he had attempted to save the company, that market forces and the rise of e-commerce had made Sears' decline inevitable, that he had invested billions of his own fund's capital trying to keep the operation alive. Both things can be true simultaneously. The decline may have been inevitable, and the architecture of that decline may have been designed to ensure that specific parties captured the residual value. These are not contradictions. They are the same event described from two vantage points, but the documentary's question was never really about Eddie Lampert. He was a mechanism, a function of the financial system as it operated in the early 21st century. The question was about what died when Sears died, and whether it was something that could die, or whether it had already left the building decades before the bankruptcy filing was stamped. Because here is what Sears was at its origin. It was a system for delivering goods to people whom the market had decided were not worth serving. Rural families, isolated communities, black customers in the Jim Crow South who could not walk into a local department store and be treated with dignity. The catalogue did not see your skin colour. It did not know your address was on the wrong side of the tracks. It processed your order and shipped your goods and cashed your cheque, and that was the entire transaction. The access it provided was not incidental to the business. It was the business. Julius Rosenwald understood this completely. That understanding is what connected his commercial work to his philanthropic work. The schools and the stores were built on the same principle. People who had been excluded from systems deserved access to those systems. If the existing institutions would not provide that access, you built new ones. When Lampert structured the writ, when he separated the real estate from the operations, when he allowed the stores to decay while the properties beneath them appreciated, he was not violating some abstract principle of retail management. He was completing a process that had begun decades earlier, when the company stopped understanding itself as an access mechanism and started understanding itself as a collection of assets. The question it closed was the mechanical one. Now we know what happened to the company, how it was disassembled, who profited, and what the workers lost. That question has answers in public filings. The question it opens is harder. What happened to the idea the company once carried? The idea that every American, regardless of geography or race or income, deserved access to the same goods at the same prices? Did that idea survive in another form? Did it migrate to another institution? Or did it simply dissolve when the last catalogue was printed, when the last store went dark in a county where nothing replaced it? The answer is in Macon County, Alabama. It has been there since 1917. The schoolhouse still stands. It's a modest structure, wood frame, painted white, with tall windows designed to let in maximum daylight, because many of the original schools had no electricity. The architectural plans were drafted by professors at Tuskegee, refined over years of construction and feedback from the communities that used them. Every detail served a practical purpose. The windows faced specific directions to capture morning light. The cloakrooms doubled as buffer zones against cold drafts. The buildings were designed to be constructed by local labour, people who knew how to work wood and lay foundations, people who would take pride in a building they had raised with their own hands. This particular school was one of the 4,977 built between 1912 and 1932. After Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, when school desegregation became the law of the land, many Rosenwald schools were closed and abandoned. The students were absorbed into integrated public schools, and the buildings, no longer needed for their original purpose, fell into disrepair. Hundreds were demolished, and hundreds more simply rotted, their wood returning to the Alabama soil that had grown the trees from which they'd been milled. But some survived. Some were converted to community centres, churches, private homes. Some were simply forgotten, standing empty in fields, passed by on county roads without anyone quite remembering what they were. And then, starting in the early 2000s, a recognition began to build. These buildings were among the most significant architectural artifacts of black education in America. They were not museums, but evidence that a system had functioned, that communities had organised, that children had been taught, that a different arrangement of resources was possible when someone with capital decided to use it as a lever rather than a monument. The National Trust for Historic Preservation placed Rosenwald schools on its list of most endangered historic places in 2002. Community organisations across the South began restoration efforts. In Macon County, the county where Tuskegee sits, where Booker T. Washington built his institute, where the first 6 pilot schools were constructed in 1912. Restored Rosenwald schools now operate as community gathering spaces, as local history archives, as proof of what was built when the money served a purpose beyond its own multiplication. Less than 15 miles from one of these restored schoolhouses, a former Sears store sits empty. Its parking lot, once engineered to hold 300 cars on a Saturday afternoon, has begun returning to scrub. Grass pushes through the asphalt cracks. The concrete foundation remains because concrete does not rot the way wood does, but nothing grows inside it. The anchor tenant is gone. The shopping centre it once supported has partially closed around the gap it left. No luxury tenant replaced this particular store. Macon County is not the kind of market that attracts a Nordstrom rack. The Seritage model worked in affluent suburbs. It did not work everywhere. 2 structures, both funded directly or indirectly by the same fortune. One was built to grow, to compound, to scale until it dominated its market, and then to continue growing because growth was its only logic. It lasted 132 years from founding to bankruptcy, which seemed like permanence until you realize it isn't. The other was built to be given away, to spend itself into nothing, to function for exactly as long as it was needed, and then to release its resources back into the community that had helped construct it. Julius Rosenwald ordered his foundation to close within 25 years of his death, because he believed that money which outlived its purpose stopped being a tool and became a monument to the person who'd given it. He did not want monuments, he wanted schools. The fund closed in 1948, exactly as instructed, and yet the schools remain, not because anyone endowed them in perpetuity, not because a trust fund maintains them. They remain because the communities they served decided they were worth preserving. They remain because the labour that built them was local, and the memory of that labour persisted in families who passed the buildings every day. They remain because a structure built for people, by people, with people's own investment of sweat and lumber and county tax dollars, belongs to those people in a way that a retail outlet never belongs to the town where it's located. In 2018, the year Sears filed for bankruptcy, you could still walk into a Rosenwald school in Macon County. You could touch the window frames. You could see where the cloakroom met the classroom. You could stand in a building that Julius Rosenwald's money helped construct 86 years earlier, and you could feel it doing what it was always meant to do, holding a community's history in a form that the community itself could inhabit. You could not do the same at the Sears store down the road. The locks had been changed. The inventory had been trucked away. The name on the building belonged to a holding company registered in Delaware, and the man who controlled that holding company was in a Manhattan law firm at 2 a.m, buying what remained. One institution was built to last. One was built to grow. In the county where both began, only one still stands with its doors open and its purpose intact. The schools outlived the store. The gift outlived the fortune.